Good evening, Stephen Conte. Welcome to Bendigo Writers Festival Backstory, our weekly series where we do the backstory on new books with writers. The one we're talking about today is the Tolstoy Estate, which is a redolent title, something which you think, well, what on earth is this going to be about? And it turns out that, again, like the Zookeeper's War, your first book, your book which won the Prime Minister's Award, the inaugural Prime Minister's Award, way back in 2009?
Oh, sorry, the award was 2008.
Eight, right. We'll compromise. Like that one, it's set in the Second World War. So I don't want to do, I mean, we are called Backstory, so it's good to be able to go back, and a lot of people will say, Stephen Conte, and I guess you're getting that a lot now. I wondered what happened to the man who won the inaugural Prime Minister's Award, which was a shockingly great $100,000, which I suspect is the reason a lot of people sat up and took notice of it. But that's 13 years since you did, you hit the headlines then. And I do want to remind people that 13 years ago, we still had Colleen McCulloch, we still had Christopher Koch, we had the Miles Franklin, that following year was actually won by Stephen Carroll for the Time We Have Taken. Wonderful Stephen Carroll, a Melbourne writer. We had Mireille Juchot, we had Charlotte Wood, we had Michelle de Kretzer, we had Alex Miller, all of whom published books in the year that the Zookeeper's War came out of the blue, really. Is it fair to say that it came out of the blue? It must have been for a young man of 36-ish, I think you were back then. Was it now, can you look back and remind us of what that meant to you?
Well, your audience, well, first of all, Rosemary, thanks so much for having me. Your audience will know that story of supposed overnight successes who, of course, have been labouring in the minds of their craft for, years or perhaps decades beforehand. And, I'm one of those. Before the Zookeeper's War was published, I had written a novel that wasn't accepted for publication. I'd been a teenage aspirant novelist. And so, and you flattered me with my age there a bit. Ultimately, I was a late developer because that novel was not published until I was 41. So I had the gift of knowing what I wanted to do, but not, unlike other people who are able to pursue their dreams, I wasn't being able to be paid along the way. So it was certainly a long journey even to get to the starting line, as it were.
Why then did we get, and I think that the first, the novels, the stuff you were writing, the books you were writing, the work you were writing beforehand, was not set during the war, and it wasn't in Berlin. So why did we, why has this now become, with your second book, almost your signature? Yep.
Well, yeah, so I've now written a total of 4 novels, 2 of them set in the Second World War and 2 of them with settings in contemporary Australia. So in a way, it's accidental that World War II has become my genre, but it's certainly something that's absolutely always been fascinating to me. The simple explanation is that as a young man, I lived in Berlin for a few months in 1986 while the wall was still up. And I found it just an incredibly compelling, evocative, atmospheric place where, you could climb up on the platforms overlooking the wall and see the East German guards swivel their binoculars at you. And then when I left, I continued to read about the city, and I read an account of the zoo being bombed and thought, this is incredibly cinematic, it's incredibly novelistic, and it was that setting that actually then set me seeking characters. So that's the sort of surface answer, but there's a deeper psychological appeal to me as well, because a lot of my character was formed in the fire of a boys' boarding school, and I'm only half joking when I say that when I encountered history of the Third Reich or the Second World War, that had a sort of a deep sense of recognition about what it is to live in a system that's, without seeking to equate the two, a sort of pseudo-totalitarian system where might makes right, and there's a hypocrisy about values and so on. And also, yeah, those European stories really appealed to me too at another level. Australian literature, and for that matter, American literature, it seems to me that sort of underlying trope is about the encounter with vast open spaces. So Patrick White's Voss, for example, or at the end of Huckleberry Finn, Huck strikes out for the territories. Well, that wasn't my personal psychological experience. I had a more European experience of being trapped in situ. And so I've always been interested in European literature in the way that the characters are often cornered, whether it's by class or in a tenement, as my characters in The Zookeeper's War are. And so I've always responded to it deeply psychologically.
I was just thinking, as you were talking, of Patrick White's use of spaces and houses and traps and in language as well. You're a Patrick White reader?
I've just a couple of his novels. They're fascinating and demanding. I mean, my experience of them is to teeter between absolute fascination and occasionally, I'll confess, boredom. But which is a strange situation. I mean, in a way, it's sort of testament to White's brilliance that he's not from central casting as a writer to put you in that state of mind.
Yes, which brings us to Tolstoy, because I'll confess that not my first choice of reading. Anna Karenina, I think, is, like most of these enormous European novels, you think you have to read them, but sometimes you're thinking, I don't know what's, or I don't like his characters or whatever. So that brings us to the Tolstoy Estate. And I'm thinking the title has got a kind of a double thing. It's the buildings, which we're talking about here, but it's also the legacy, the estate of Tolstoy. And I know that you read Tolstoy when you were 15. You've mentioned that, and you have your character, Paul, I think, reads Tolstoy first when he's 15. So did the Tolstoy thing happen first, or did Tolstoy come in partway through as you're planning this?
So again, it's a sort of story of the immediate inspiration and the more underlying geological layer of inspiration. So Tolstoy wasn't the immediate inspiration for the book. That was another much less well-known book, a book of war reportage by Eva Curie, who was the daughter of Marie Curie, the discoverer of radium. And at the outbreak of the war, she was a writer in her late 30s. She was already world famous as her mother's biographer. She escaped the Nazis, went to New York, and was given a job by Time magazine to cover the war. And so she set out and had all sorts of extraordinary adventures. Met Chiang Kai-shek, just quite extraordinary adventures. And one of them was to be taken to see the recently liberated Tolstoy Estate, just 300 kilometers to the southwest of Moscow, only 3 weeks after it was liberated from the Germans. So by this time, early 1942. And she spoke and reported speaking to the locals there, who described the German occupation. And what really grabbed my attention was the sense in which both the Germans who set up a hospital there and the local custodians were ultra conscious of that this was an ideological battle, that because the site was a sort of a national shrine to the memory of the great writer of national resistance to a foreign invader, that everyone was aware of its importance, almost its metaphysical importance, as a symbolizing whether Russia or not would have the vigor to resist this new invader. And so that was what gave me the initial inspiration. But then I uncovered then my interest, that underlying inspiration and influence of reading Tolstoy as a 14, 15-year-old came up, and once again, that's a boarding school story, because literature was my salvation. It's what I turned to when I sought privacy. And it was by far and away the most precocious bit of reading I did as a teenager. and it had that strong underlying influence, so that when I did encounter Curie's story, I was immediately activated. Oh, I could see the potential.
Were you reading, when you say encounter, it's as though you're, you know, strolling along the streets of wherever you were and, oh, look, there's a book. You were clearly fossicking for something to write about, so you came across the Curie in that way?
No, I wasn't fossicking with the intention to write another book about the Second World War. In fact, I'd sort of sworn off it. You know, I'm someone who has, a lot of writers come from bookish families, and I'm fortunate enough to have a really thoughtful, literary-minded mother who actually, you know, she recommended the book to me. It was on her shelf. She dug it out of a secondhand store. And so I picked it up. It was fascinating, and there it was. The story just leapt out to me. I mean, in some respects, it's got similarities to the to the Zookeeper's War, in the sense that it is a setting. In that case, the zoo. In this case, this estate, giving it a unity of place, a subculture. You know, in one case, zookeeping. In this case, a hospital, a military hospital. And so it gave a container into which I poured the characters.
I'm so envious of you having a mother who would say, read this, Stephen. How wonderful is that? It's a superb part of your book too, the legacy of reading and what it can do. I mean, there's conversations in the book that a lot of people have called meta-narrative, you know, talking about writing and reading, which is a real bonus, I think, for readers as well. But you didn't, I don't think, I might be wrong, but you didn't actually visit the Tolstoy Estate to write this, which might surprise some people.
Yes, so I guess that's less than ideal. The opportunity didn't arise. I was doing other things, parenting and so on. But I genuinely believe it's less of an obstacle, less of a shortcoming than some might feel, because the truth is that a book takes fire between the words on the page or the screen and the reader, and in the reader's imagination, and it's the reader who really creates the world with a few cues that the writer provides. So the writer provides a stylized take on the world that the reader fills out. And so I was emboldened to just to use a little smoke and mirrors there, knowing that I'd be relying primarily on my readers to evoke that world. The writer Mark Henshaw once pointed out to me that, you know, you don't want to necessarily evoke the most obvious symbols and landscapes and landmarks when you're evoking a place. Don't put the Eiffel Tower into a book about Paris. Just throw in an Algerian migrant instead, and the reader will do the rest. So I feel that, and also I couldn't revisit the past. You know, this is a book set in 1941, and all of us have to do the imaginative work to evoke a story from the past.
Yes, and which some of our listeners and watchers will be saying, yes, but what's it about, Rosemary? Ask him, what's the story? Because we're circling around it, and it's a story that that in a way, like a lot of novels, you don't really want to say what it's about. In a way, you want people to unfold it for themselves, but you do start in the mud. It's 1941. Paul, you're the hero, and I do that because, you know, there's another hero, and that's Katerina, the Russian woman. Katerina's looking after the Tolstoy estate. Paul is a doctor. He's with the German advancing army, and they turn up at this place, the Tolstoy building, the estate, where they set up a field hospital. And it's a crucial time of the war because things are going to turn rather bad for Germany. And so we have a confrontation, a conflict between Katerina, who's very feisty, and Paul, who's very decent. Now, I think it's a really interesting choice to make a German part of the advancing forces and employed by the German, by the Nazis, really, to be a decent man. So I guess I'm puzzled by why you chose to put these two people into conflict and then to make him into a hero. You know, it's not somebody coming in from the, I don't know, the American forces turn up soon after, I think, don't they? And or one of the Allied forces. So why did you choose to make Paul such a decent fellow?
So I think readers are obviously fascinated by World War II as a setting, and you can look at countless literary novels, whether it's Atonement or, well, say Snow Falling on Cedars, or books of that nature. I like to think of it as our Homeric age, a period when ordinary people got to live these extraordinary lives of adventure as well as horror. And I think within that, there's a risk that as readers from a formerly allied nation, there is a risk of a moral complacency in that. I mean, it is probably fair to say that it was a just war. And I've always enjoyed the moral and ethical complexity of thinking, oh, but what's it like to be, was it like to be on the other side? I mean, as it happens, my Italian father was on guard duty for the other side, you know, in Taranto in southern Italy, you know, so ordinary people were on both sides, and also decent people. You know, Hitler only got 33% of the vote when he came to power, and then was installed as dictator with various maneuvers. And while it's fair to say that, you know, certainly in the early stages of the war, when Germany had a lot of success, probably the vast bulk of the German people were pro-Hitler, pro-war. There were many people, it's just reality, who were former social democrats, who were people you might recognise now amongst your friends, who are progressively minded people. Those people existed in Germany as well. It wasn't as if 100% of the population were sort of Nazis. And so I think I was more interested in that struggle of a decent man. Others have written books about through and through Nazis, and there are through and through Nazis in this book. And so I just was interested in that particular dilemma. How, as a decent person, do you grapple with the unspeakable? And I wanted Paul to be a stand-in for the reader as well. I mean, the truth is that, I mean, he's a bookish fellow. The vast majority of people who read novels are also thoughtful, reflective, humane, compassionate people. I mean, what percentage of your audience, you know, hopes that Trump will win the next US election? That's not our tribe. And so I wanted to tell Paul's story and of an encounter of a decent man.
Yes, and I think it's not giving something away, because it's pretty obvious right from the start, the way you set up Katerina and Paul, that there's going to be an attraction there. She's funny because she defends Russia, she defends her people, and then I hope it's not giving away too much. I don't think it is, to say that later on she explains, you know, that actually I wasn't that happy about what was going on, but she's very. She comes out of a point of anger, so she explains that much later. And part of the book, of course, and I don't think it's giving anything away as well, is you move forward and back in time, and you put some of the telling in the form of letters, and then we come right through to you know, much more recent times. So there's a sense of lives quite well lived, and some that are lost very early as well. So there's a lot of tragedy in the book. Stephen, you mention often when you answer books that you've read, like Snow Falling on Cedars and, you know, other writers, and you also mention where you get the ideas and for the background of this kind of book. Your research must have been, though, formidable. I can't begin to imagine how much you actually did in terms of reading for this book.
Well, the answer is less broadly than for the Zookeeper's War. For the Zookeeper's War, I did a lot of establishing reading about almost a day-by-day histories of what was going on in the war, social histories of the Third Reich, so understanding what motherhood was like, understanding what the holidays of ordinary German people was like, and in amongst, and reading lots of memoirs by, well, progressively minded people who you know, were able to publish after the war. And probably, so I felt as though I had an understanding of the era and the milieu of someone like Paul. And probably way back in that research, that central understanding or insight that in many ways these were modern people. I mean, of course, it's always a continuum, but those mid-20th century, especially Bohemian people, it's been said that the 20s was the 1960s for the rich. Not that any of my characters are wealthy, but, you know, for that Bohemian type, their mindset was incredibly thoughtful, progressive, and, you know, the technology was in many ways very modern. So I felt that I had that backstory, and that, in fact, for this novel, really I needed to learn about Katerina's story, which was an understanding of what it was like to be a young woman in the 1920s as a revolutionary, what the cultural milieu was like in Moscow in the 1920s before the Stalinist terror. And the other big amount of research was war surgery, because, you know, amongst other things, this is a war story, it's a love story, and it's also a hospital drama. It's a dark Teutonic version of MASH. And I wanted to, and there's a scene in the book where Paul performs surgery during a battle for 37 hours straight. And I wanted to really bring the readers into that moment so that they knew what it was like to be exhausted, to be cutting when you're virtually cross-eyed with fatigue. And as you can imagine, it's quite tricky to understand exactly where surgery was at that moment, in particular because, like everything in the Second World War, technology rapidly evolved. So there are differences between 1941 and 1943, and the Germans never got penicillin, but as you know, as you can imagine, things did rapidly change.
Yes, I was going to ask you about the medical side, but you've answered that now, and it's not so much that you wanted to be a doctor when you grew up.
Well, you know, there are a lot. Well, one of the things I think is interesting is that there are, in a lot of seemingly non-autobiographical books, like an historical novel like this one, there are actually really personal strands, and one of them is that, okay, I never wanted to be a doctor. But I come from a medical family. My mother is a retired nurse and my stepfather was a doctor. And so medicine has been in my imaginary really strongly from the beginning. And so that was another aspect of when I encounter Curie's story. I thought, oh, this is my story. This is waiting for me to write, because not only am I interested in the war, in that contest between two totalitarian systems, and in literature, hey, I want to write a hospital drama. So that was what was incredibly thrilling, to just make that discovery.
It's very funny. I hadn't actually realised that was, but it makes sense, because it's certainly a really big and important part, and his ability to help some people and not to be able to help others. There's a moment, again, I definitely won't give this moment away, but when you make a decision as the writer to tell a story of, it's a side story, and I think you know which story I'm talking about, and we'll leave people to discover that for themselves. Did you have to, I'm guessing that some of these side stories you must have gone, will it slow things down? How am I going to incorporate it? Will it work properly? Am I being too greedy? Because it's there's a way, there's a sense that you're a storyteller who's got a greed to put lots of ideas into a book.
So I had the big scene that I've already referred to. It's a lengthy scene in the book, and because I wanted to really, as I said before, to bring the reader into the operating theatre. And right from the word go there, I had a sense that that was going to work, that readers would be fascinated, as I had been in my research, to encounter these descriptions of these unending surgeries. And I just always, and so far, at least the feedback I've got is that people have been, like I was, absolutely transfixed by that particular scene. Beyond that, just for the purposes of realism, I wanted, because that occurs, well, 40% of the way through the book or so, just for the purpose of realism, I felt that the reader needed to encounter Paul as a surgeon doing his profession. And I think readers, that's one of the things that readers of fiction do enjoy, I think. It's a famously underexplored part of contemporary fiction, people at their jobs. But actually, I think when people's jobs are unusual and interesting, readers are fascinated to see a character deploying their expertise. And so, yeah, it's a balance. How much do you drag in? But then also, I didn't want him to be, oh, Paul the surgeon, and it just to be a rhetorical ploy. I wanted to show him at his work.
Did you, and I know other people have asked you about this, because it's impossible not to notice very early how strongly you weight scenes towards dialogue. And there are long conversations right at the start when they're turning up at the Tolstoy Estate, but later on as well, there are long conversations about literature, of all things, between Katerina and Paul. So you've worked very hard, I think, since maybe the first book. You obviously enjoy the idea of grasping the dialogue and getting that dialogue really moving along in ways that aren't really realistic, because nobody can talk that well in real life, I don't think. Can they, Stephen, do you think? I mean, you have to be...
Okay, so this is a huge topic. So this whole issue of dialogue, it's the thing that I felt that I have learned and applied myself to as a writer. It certainly wasn't something I felt that came naturally to me as a younger writer. Now, there's two categories of dialogue within the book, and one of them I like to think is a very sharp, almost telegraphic style. So perhaps if any of your readers know about the dialogue of Don DeLillo, the sort of elliptical, not direct ways that people speak, you know, and reflecting that, the ways that people don't explain themselves in perfectly grammatical sentences. So, or almost Raymond Carver-esque, that really pared down dialogue. So there's that. And then there are, you're right, this other style in which characters like Paul and Katerina talk about ideas. Now, all dialogue is stylized, but I would contend, Rosemary, that people do talk about this. It's like that. Like people like you and I now do talk with varying degrees of eloquence about ideas. It actually is realistic. And ideas are a basis of the attraction between Paul and Katerina. And so I because I'm aware that we're not accustomed to seeing ideas discussed explicitly in novels, I acknowledge that in the text to show the reader that I know what I'm up to here. I'm sort of planting my flag, planting my standard, and say, well, look at your own life. You do talk about ideas, and it may not be, it is a difficult thing to incorporate in fiction, but I wanted to rise to the challenge to do that in a way that seemed reasonable, plausible, and realistic.
Also, letter writing. I mean, I'm listening to you now and thinking, I mean, I always wish I could speak like the characters in your book. And the more you practice, the better you become at it. And that's why writers' festivals, I think, are really important, because we're able to listen to people at their very best talking about something they know about and framing it very well. And the more you talk about it, as you well know now, the Zoom things that you're doing, the better you become each time. And you go, oh, yes, I can do that next time. Letter writing, though, gee, that's going to be a lost art. And what you use the letters for in your book is to move the narrative along at a really economical pace. It's a decision. Did that come? Were you always going to incorporate letters?
No, that was a discovery, but it was a discovery, but relatively early on in the writing. I wanted to give the reader the satisfaction, that sort of perhaps elementary satisfaction of knowing where are they now, what happened. it's a satisfaction that you get neatly at the end of a lot of Victorian fiction or 19th century fiction in a sort of a epilogue style. And I didn't want, though, to have that information just tacked on awkwardly to the end. And so because I like teasing the reader too and making them really want to, well, in a playful way, frustrating them to excite them and to get them in a state of suspense, and then to hold on there, hold your horses, I was inserted these letters, you know, also at the same time accomplishing, hopefully, a sense of the scope of these people's lives, because although I wasn't up to writing a book of the length of War and Peace, I wanted to gesture at the grandeur of what a life can be, lived over decades, lived over continents, and that was my economical method of doing Tolstoy light.
I don't think it is Tolstoy light. I think it's Tolstoy sort of necessarily updated. And I did want to ask you, as the time moves on, so is Tolstoy still readable and important?
Like a lot of those 19th century writers, especially the men, I think there's problems with gender, but you know, a lot of people have, I'm going to invoke Freud here, a lot of people have problems with Freud's treatment of gender and women, and yet what we forget, it's anachronistic in a way. What we forget is that writers like Tolstoy, who, in a sense, very messed up attitude to women, and thinkers like Freud were actually in their time real trailblazers in lavishing their attention on women. You know, Tolstoy most famously in Anna Karenina. And so I think if you read with a sense that actually these men are actually really treating women seriously for the first time, and then doing all of these other things, including that key thing of empathy and compassion. There's a moment in War and Peace when the heroine Sonia Rostova is being tempted to have an affair with a cad and a bounder. You know, that Tolstoy has this uncanny sympathy for Sonia's sexual craving. That's my reading of it, at least. And, you know, it's a deep insight into what it is to be a 23-year-old woman who has no acceptable outlet for her sexual instincts. And this is in a context of writing in the Victorian period. So, yes, absolutely. Tolstoy has things to say about women. He has things to say about war. He has things to say about drawing room repartee, and just the quiddity of life, the sensation of a speck of ice, or the wrinkle in someone's leather boots at the heel. So absolutely, he's still relevant.
And not just relevant, you're admiring the style of his manner, his ability to write as well, and the role of literature, which is really what, in some ways, this book is about. For those watchers who want to know what it's about, it's really about whether novels can still matter. And hearing you talk about it, it seems to me that they can still matter and make a difference.
Well, you know, the book, amongst other things, is a dialogue that I'm having. Well, I have my characters engage in on my behalf, because this is a question that I ask myself too, because I'm sometimes discouraged. I see, well, can the novel prevent a Trump, or what did the novel ever do to prevent Vietnam? But to take just one random example, but as I have my character Katerina say, you know, you can be too easily discouraged, because the truth is that things could have been worse, and who knows that humane example of the novel, this engine for generating empathy, this technology of perspective taking, who knows how much that has improved the world in the last 200, 300 years, and what horrors have we avoided because someone had a more humane insight into what it was to be human from their reading or their mother's reading, or who knows. So it's my thing, and so I choose to have faith in it and choose to to have faith in the values that it helps propagate, enduring in our culture. See, my role it's our job to not to drop the baton, to pass the baton on to whoever's coming.
No, that's a terrific answer. But I was going to, maybe a quick last question. Is there a ghost of Tolstoy?
So I'm happy to acknowledge too. I mean, one of that there is no, to my knowledge, established ghost at Yasnaya Polyana, his former estate. But when I was drawing up my list of characters, always at the top there was Tolstoy. I wanted Tolstoy to be a character because it was clear from the testimony of the Germans and the locals that he was a presiding presence there, even though at the time he'd been dead for 30 years. And it was during the writing that I suddenly had this moment of delight, that moment of pure creativity, and I thought, well, why not make him an actual ghost, if only in the minds of a couple of the characters. And it was a joyful thing to just, okay, let's throw in another genre here on top of the hospital drama, on top of the love story, because what perhaps I haven't conveyed about the book is that there's a lot of humor in it. There's a lot of playfulness as well. It's not unremitting gloom or violence, and so that tickled my fancy. And it also felt that the naivety of the characters who give credence to this apparent ghost really spoke to me of the deep irrationality of the Nazis in general. There's this stereotype of the Germans being systematic, rational peoples, but in fact Nazism was deeply, deeply superstitious and crazy and self-defeating and illogical. The film Raiders of the Lost Ark, I've been saying in a couple of interviews, is actually not that far off the mark. I dare say there was a sub-ministry seeing if there was some sort of supernatural way to win the war. And so I wanted a character, in this case, the commanding officer, fellow surgeon of Paul Bauer's Julius Metz, who reflected that and in his crazy belief system.
Yes, that's probably my fault for not conveying the humour, because that scene that I refer to, it's such an economical scene, but it's kind of has stayed with me, I must confess, Stephen. It stayed with me in a way that's going to take a bit to shake. So I understand what you're saying. You leaven that with scenes of pretty black humour, mad, crazy people doing crazy things, and they survive. And I had 100 other questions to ask, but I think we should leave other people to find out some answers for themselves and to ask you. Thank you so much. It's been terrific to talk with you, and to revisit the Second World War at a time when I think we do need that thing you were saying about the Raiders of the Lost Ark and how to win the war is just resonating with me right now, and remembering how crazy people in power can be. Thanks so much for joining us. Best of luck with this book, and we look forward to the contemporary Australian novel from Stephen Conte, maybe not 13 years from now though, eh?
Definitely not. No, I'll move more rapidly. So,
thanks, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Rosemary, for having me.
Bye.
Bye.